Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about or compare, if you like, communism and fascism. Now, fascism is the one that gets the sort of the bum rap, and communism and Marxism and socialism and that sort of thing is really certainly in the modern educational and socio-political dialogue, it's toned down quite a bit, and many of its murderous sins are forgiven. Whereas the Hitler side of things is ginned up. I was looking at a history channel, an online history channel, a few days ago, and just seems like every fucking second documentary is about Hitler and how evil the Nazis. Now, if you look back at the money that's being put into this and the production companies and that sort of thing, it's very, very Jewish, and they want to keep this alive for as long as they can. It certainly served them very well. But we look at that architecture of victimhood deserving compensation and the breaks. It's being used now by the the Black Lives Matter and so on. So we've got to assume it's the same people behind it. But just having a look at comparing fascism and communism, were they equally totalitarian and equally oppressive? Was fascism much worse? You'd think by looking at the literature around the place, whether it be online or elsewhere, and certainly at the imagery. I mean, if you sort of put totalitarian into, say, your search bar, and it'll come up, and I found that it was the Hitler references were outnumbering the communism, but depending on which side you got onto, but between say 4 and 5 to 1. So clearly Hitler is considered to be the representation of oppression. If anyone in the street where they talk about anything they don't like, the street mob agitators, BLM, whatever. College kids screaming about trans. The first thing that comes to their mouth, "You're a fascist, you're a Nazi, you're Hitler." And yet you ask them about this and say, well, what is fascism? I don't know. I've got no fucking idea. So it's something that they're just throwing out there without comprehending it. So just having a look at these alternative sort of administrative, governmental, social structure ideologies, such as fascism and or the different brands, like Mussolini's brand of fascism was different from Hitler's brands, and or the Nazi brand, and the communism practiced in the Soviet Union wasn't exactly the same as the communism practiced in, say, China or Cambodia or anywhere else for that matter. So we need to look at the times, though. Now, when Marx first talked about in the Communist Manifesto in sort of 1848, I think it was, and then in the 1870s in Das Kapital about the socialist state or the communist state, the view was that Marx took, and I think I'm one of these people that, whilst I don't agree with the theories with conclusions rather that Marx reached, I think Marx was a great thinker of this, one of the great thinkers of all time. Again, not agreeing with his conclusions, but in the breadth and the depth and the analysis that he put, I think he was a great thinker. Nonetheless, he put forward these ideas that the distribution of wealth between the, as Marx would put it, the bourgeoisie and the working class or the masses was such that that disparity was unfair, is unreasonable. The working classes would rise up and would create a workers' paradise. Now, Marx fell into the trap that often people do, is if you just take the bad things away, then only the good things will stay behind, and then it will be a paradise. And it's quite a childlike view of things. You see that same attitude today in the globalists. They have this childlike view, a naive view that well, if we just tinker with this and that, we just take that away, then paradise anew will appear magically before our eyes. And this is, of course, the communist failing that it can be done. Now, Marx and another communist, by the way, the Hegels and really you could go back to the French Revolution, guys like Rousseau and so on. The idea was that an organic development of society would automatically create inequalities, and therefore to prevent these inequalities appearing in the first place or taking root or existing, then there was a need for intervention by the state to create this paradise. That state couldn't be that government interference or government implementation of those policies that were supposed to lead to this magical nirvana. That couldn't be done through the existing order. Therefore, the existing order had to be overthrown by armed revolution and a People's Party put in place that would then implement these things. So that was sort of I'm paraphrasing and simplifying here, but that was the general idea. Now, the Europe that Marx saw was one that was rapidly changing from an agricultural society to an industrial society, and Marx went to England. He'd been effectively evicted from Europe. He got kicked out of Germany and got kicked out of France and Belgium, and then got kicked. Then went to England at that stage, or Britain, the freest, most open society in Europe. So Marx set up shop there with his buddy, his quite wealthy buddy, Friedrich Engels, that kept on financially bailing Marx out of his financial problems, but and giving Marx the time to dedicate it to his big treatise, Das Kapital. But Marx, the views that Marx held were very much tied to the times and the immediate circumstances around him. The Industrial Revolution, there was a parallel agricultural revolution going, where there's much higher levels of productivity on the land. The tiny small plot holdings that existed previously were changing to larger, not large by American standards, but the farms were getting bigger, and therefore the idea of the tenant serf, feudal farmer type thing was passing, and the people were moving to the cities to go and work in the new factories. Now, the factories were just thrown up wherever they could. There's a few machines there, and then they were stuck in pretty haphazard way. You could hardly say health and safety issues were at the forefront of anyone's concerns. So Marx saw the wretched conditions of people who'd gone from the clean and open, fresh air of the countryside into the smokestacks of the city, looked at this and thought, well, look at these poor, wretched people. And it can't have been an edifying sight. And he said, well, these people are oppressed, and they're oppressed by the people who have the money. Therefore, so revolution is needed. Now, that was the situation, Marx. Let's fast forward now to the late 1920s and into the 1930s. The Great Depression was a huge shock to the world economy, not just the United States, but all over, particularly the advanced industrial economies. And not that other economies weren't affected, but the advanced industrial ones were sort of more exposed because of their higher levels of debt and all sorts of things like that, and heavy investment in manufacturing and manufacturing capacity. So the world was coming to the view that capitalism had failed. It had failed once because the capitalists had a huge world war which killed gazillions of people. And so already capitalism was sort of in the dock as being looked at as being rather suspect and being the cause of or partial cause of military conflict, which you could argue that, I guess. But so there was a brief period of economic recovery after the war, where there was a lot of prosperity then and overinvestment in the stock market and the like. And in 1929, you've got the big Wall Street crash, which then ignites a worldwide depression. And again, we're talking unemployment of 25 to 30%. Even more in some places. But we need to look at the structure of the economy at the time. That there was a vast number of day labourers. That because the economy was so buoyant and there was so much activity, day labourers and people who had no skills or were just really, if you could hold a hammer and bang in a nail somewhere, you could make a decent living for yourself. So there was this vast workforce of effectively itinerant labourers. And when the Depression came, not all, but many of these people suddenly found themselves out of a job. A lot of people were still employed. The majority of the population was still employed, but those people were gone. And the people who still had jobs most of them had less discretionary income than they may have had previously. So the population of the world was looking, so, well, capitalism has failed. This system that we have of capitalism, it's failed. It's failed the people. It's failed the masses. Look at the hunger. Look at the starvation. Look at the privation. We have to find another way of doing it. Amidst all this prosperity of the Western world, the advanced manufacturing economies, which Germany was one, by the way, this idea we have to find a better way, another way, a different way of doing it. So capitalism, or what had hitherto been seen as the social politics of capitalism, that was seen as having failed. And look, here's the evidence right in front of it. Look at all those starving fucking people. It's failed. So the populations and thinkers and intellectuals and columnists in newspapers were looking. There must be another way. Now, many of the journalists of the time, majority, as far as I can tell, were Jewish, and also the people that ran the movie houses and pumped out the newsreels, and so they were very much of the view, anyway, that communism and equal outcomes, that they were very much, not so much equal outcomes, but communism, socialism, and a system of managing society whereby no one group could be victimized. And this is very much a Jewish thing. They think, well, if we can create a society where we'll never be victimized again, then that will be a better society we currently have. And if we have a society where moral positioning is effectively going to be the aristocracy of that society, then we, the Jews, will be the aristocracy of this supposedly equal society. So very much part of the thinking and the attitudes of the time. And if we look at the communist revolutions in Europe, or attempted revolutions in Europe, and the uprisings, they were disproportionately, in fact, close to all of them, including the uprisings in Germany, were disproportionately involving Jewish leaders. Many of these being homosexual and lesbian, such as Rosa Luxemburg, the Jewish lesbian school teacher who was part of the Spartacist uprising, and others. So we've got this convergence of very influential Jewish sector in the United States, particularly the East European and Russian Jews that had emigrated to the US in the 1880s and around that time, and from elsewhere. And again, they're very prominent in media and news and newspapers and that sort of thing. So they're looking at that their moment has arrived, but looking at what capitalism's failed. What other systems of government are there? Now, communism was one, so we all equally share everything, and that's a huge. Anyone that looks at that just on a prima facie basis, we're going to share everything equally. I mean, who would argue with that? That seems like that would be a nice, kind, and loving and gentle society where everybody shares everything, and wants to, and is inclined to, and takes pleasure from sharing their, the bread off their table with their neighbour, and so on. It's very much a starry-eyed view of things, but nonetheless, on the face of it. But other types of government and social structures and so on were being looked at, and one of these was the various brands of social, state, and business collaboration that would create a better outcome for society. Again, a lot of starving, hungry people around Who wants that? Nobody wants that. Let's try and find a way to correct it. The system we have is failing. Let's find a new way. And if you were in that time as well, or I was, we too would have been caught up in that. There must be a better way of doing it. So anyway, so fascism came along as well. Now, was communism and fascism bad as each other? There's a few differences. The definition of totalitarian, certainly by today's standard, is complete and total subservience to the state. That's the definition of totalitarian. Now, you can argue about whether that definition fully captures the wider implications of totalitarianism, but let's run with that just for the moment. Now, there are a few things that the communists, certainly as it went with the Soviets and later the Chinese, ideology came first. The rule of law, due legal process, contract, obligation, they didn't mean squat. The ideology is what. So as long as the ideology was fully intact and serviced and honoured, then you could move backwards from there to see what else would fit. But everything had to fit the ideology. And every piece of art, every movie, every newsreel, every poster, every school classroom, every curriculum, everything was dedicated to the sanctity of ideology. Not the things like mathematics weren't taught; they were, and the super brighter kids were picked off into very elite institutions. And we later would see this in things like designing space rockets and the like in 1950 Soviet Union and so on there. And the Soviet Union, in a super advanced mathematics, the communist Soviet Union was considered to be at the forefront or the apex of that top level mathematics. So it's not without its achievements. The achievements were done in a very, very narrow sense. But this idea of ideology, or this concept of ideology coming first, and to each to his needs, to each to his capacity, the idea that somebody who was fit, bright, and hardworking should produce 10 times normal amount, then share it with 9 other people so they all have an equal amount. Ideologically and in a starry-eyed sort of childlike sense, that seems, well, gee, that seems all right. But in a real world practical sense, why should that guy bust his ass every day to feed 9 other people that are doing much less or nothing or hardly anything? That's not going to go on for very long. Humans don't work that way. So the ideology was that you could reshape the complete human existence and their interactive existence, and to achieve that, you must have absolute subservience to the state. So those that demonstrated a minimal capacity subservience or weren't sufficiently subservient, it's quite okay in the ideological terms to kill them. Just kill them. Then they're a dangerous organism to the purity of the ideology, so we can kill them. But that involves killing millions, tens of millions, multiple tens of millions. Okay, but we have to preserve the ideology. That's what we're doing. And if we have to kill off 10 or 20% of the population, who gives a fuck? That's what we have to do to preserve this paradise that we're creating. Now, the Nazis, looking at Mussolini and Hitler's version of it, they took quite a different take. Anyone that disagreed with the communism was going to be imprisoned or killed, or sent to re-education camps, which is like a euphemism from having the shit beaten out of you. But the Nazis took a different view. Hitler's view was that violent armed revolution was not the way to achieve government, whereas the communists believed that armed revolution and the killing off of the elite class or the previous elite class, that was quite acceptable. In fact, it was desirable. It's how you would want it to be, whereas Hitler didn't think that. So straight away, you're seeing a difference here. Hitler believed that fascism should achieve legitimacy through the ballot box. That is, the people should vote it in. The communism believed that you just kill anyone that disagrees with you, and that armed revolution, shooting your way to government is how it needs to be, and you just impose terms on the population. If they don't like it, just kill them too. So Hitler, and straight away you see huge differences between fascism and and communism here straight away. So Hitler is adamant armed revolution is not the way to go. The reason Hitler and his goons and cronies and everything, the reason they think that is because they believe it's much more likely you can achieve your goals, as in the betterment of society, much more likely you can achieve if the people are coming with you, if they're agreeing with your policies and your remedies to social and economic ills and so on. So Hitler achieved that. Now they never got an outright majority, but in the European parliaments of the day, as it is in the current times, the idea of any party getting more than say 30-odd% of the vote is quite rare. There are so many parties and so many splinter parties and regional parties and this sort of thing that getting for a federal party, a political party, to get more than a third of the vote is very rare indeed. Now the Nazis achieved, well, I think it was 44 or 45% of the vote. And as a high point in there, which in European splintered party terms is huge. And they got and in the German constitution, or the Weimar Constitution as it was called, you had to have an outright majority, 53% of the vote, in order to form government. So the Nazis got into bed with another party that was headed by an aristocrat, Franz von Papen, and the two parties merged and they formed government in 1933. Now the Nazis again were quite different from the communists. They didn't believe that everything was propaganda. They believed that their program had to be couched in enough reality that it was saleable to the public. And they believed that public opinion was important. They wanted the public to be brought along with them. Unlike the communists, who said, you either come with us or we'll kill you. So a distinct difference there. Now, it didn't mean that Nazis didn't engage in propaganda and persuasive sort of movies and so on, but they also had many just ordinary movies for entertainment. The communists believed that entertainment in the Western sense was like decadent and indicative of a decaying society, but using entertainment for propaganda was furthering the beauty of the ideology that they were pushing. The Nazis didn't see it. Not that they didn't have propaganda movies, they did. But there were many movies and shows and so on that were for entertainment. And various other things. The Soviets viewed that product marketing and those sorts of things were again decadent, and the centrally planned economy was how to go. The Nazis saw it differently, and people were allowed to write jingles for the radio to sell this or that product. The Nazis permitted private property and private ownership. The communists did not. The Nazis permitted factory managers or owners of factories to hire whoever they wanted. If they could hire the best qualified engineers and technical salespeople and manufacturing managers. They could hire whoever they wanted. The communists, you couldn't do that. You couldn't hire who you wanted. There were times when that must have invariably happened, but you had to have political commissars. If you had a technical manager in a factory, you had to also have a political commissar to make sure that the activities of the factory and the personnel and the attitude were consistent with the ideology. The Nazis didn't have any of that. You could hire who you wanted to, and you could produce whatever goods you wanted to. Whether that be based on market demand, whether that be cosmetics for women or consumer goods like radios or cameras or those sorts of things. So the Nazis accepted market demand was a central part of the economy and part of creating an efficient economy, whereas the Soviets believed that centrally planning was it, and there was no market demand or allowance for it. So again, you see some very substantial differences here between the two. Now, there were state programs by the Nazis, such as building the autobahns as a case in point. And the Nazis did institute a wider bartering system so that Company A, instead of having to pay for say, parts or components or raw materials from somewhere else, they could actually do a round robin bartering system where the company could say, well, give us those raw, iron ore or something, give us the raw materials, and then we'll give you a certain amount of finished product, which you can then exchange for something out of that. So they had this bartering system there, which, by the way, had some similarities to how the early communists did it in bartering. I thought it seems the German one was far more efficient than the communist one because it still had the overtones of a market-driven thing. So again, there's a lot of freedoms for the individual here, and if a technical salesperson from company wherever wanted to travel from northern Germany to southern Germany or eastern Germany to western, like travel all around greater Germany, they could do that without having to go and get travel papers. Whereas in the communist societies, you couldn't do that. If you moved out of your village or wanted to move out of your village or anything like that, you had to have permission from the local political commissar and the police office. Didn't have to do that in Germany. So there's a lot more personal freedoms in Nazism than there was in the Nazi government didn't attempt to control the individual to anywhere near the extent that the communists did. Now, that didn't mean there wasn't Nazi ideology. There was, but again, it was grounded in enough reality where the people would go along with it. And this could be worship of, German historical heroes. The German guy, the Germans called him Hermann, and he was known by the Romans as Arminius, and he was the guy that was the big shaker mover in massacring those 3 Roman legions by Varus, the Roman general, in, I think it was 9 AD or somewhere around there in the Teutoburg forest. So yeah, he was a German hero, and there were other German heroes, German commanders have been involved in the Crusades and the Holy Roman Empire, and all that sort of thing, which the Holy Roman Empire had taken in quite a large section of Germany. So there was worship of these heroes, and they were ginned up. Their exploits were rewritten to be probably a little bit more flattering than they really were. But the Germans had a lot to skite about. There were a lot of German heroes, whether it be painters, musicians, various intellectuals, people involved in literature, and all sorts of achievements in engineering and science and technology. So these were all widely and openly celebrated, and the Germans were presented as being a very high, which they were, a very high achieving industrial race of people who still had plenty of gas in the tank to do better in the future. So it was couched in a lot of reality. Now, the Soviets, by contrast, the communists, they relied far more heavily on outright propaganda, not necessarily looking at their own heroes because they didn't want to revere the past, but instead saying that everyone else was bad. We must be better because all the others are bad, which is very much how the globalists are doing it today. Look how evil, look, we're surrounded by fucking Nazis. Therefore, we're the good guys because they're all Nazis, and that sort of thing. So, that's how the Soviets played it, the communists played it. Everyone else is worse. Everyone else is more badder than we are. So, on a relative basis, they elevate themselves to the moral high ground by saying everyone else is lower down the scale in the moral stakes. The Nazis didn't do that. Not that they didn't say, well, this race is inferior, or saying, not that they didn't do that, but they still kept everything in the realms of reality, which made it very different from the Soviet thing. Now, in further terms of subservience to the state, whereas the communists would kill you if you didn't go along with it, but the Nazis would tolerate to some degree of disagreement. Now, you may not get the best jobs or best access to jobs if you were going to be openly hostile to the regime, and if you went too far, then you'd get a knock on the door. But as long as your dissent was well argued, constructive, and that sort of thing, then they tended not to bother you too much. Similarly, the rule of law, if you were, at least if you were a Gentile German, the rule of law was very much is still in practice. So you would get due legal process. A warrant for your arrest had to be properly dated and signed by a judge, and so the legal system continued to function quite well with the Nazi government in there. Now, if you were, Jewish or Gypsy or Jewish homosexual, that sort of thing, then things didn't go so well. But we need to remember of almost 80 million population of the day, there was a roughly 400,000 Jews in Germany. If you add the homosexuals and the gypsies in, you're still looking at less than 1% of the population. So just to put some perspective on there. Now, the Soviets, by contrast, were victimizing tens of millions of people, and killing them, whether it be through starvation, privation, beatings, just outright murdering, mass murdering. So many more Soviet citizens were murdered by the communists just for ideological reasons. They hadn't even committed a crime. They just had the wrong thoughts, were murdered by the Soviets, far more than the Nazis ever murdered, far more. Well, far more than Nazis ever murdered. So that needs to be held in some sort of wider perspective as well. Now, so the difference in fascism, the rule of law they still observe, unless you're part of the gypsy or the homosexual diaspora. Now, given how many Jewish homosexual lesbians there are, this is something that still rankles bitterly with the Jewish activist class, not simply for the mass murdering of Jews around wider Europe at the time, but because the Nazis particularly went after Jewish homosexuals and lesbians, because there is a high proportion of homosexual lesbian Jews. The head of the US teachers union as an example, and so this is something that deeply rankles with them on a number of ideological fronts there. So when you compare the subservience to the state between the Soviet system and the fascist system, whether it be, by the way, Mussolini or Hitler, then you see that the Nazi system or fascism, Nazism, contains with it many more liberties for the individual than the communist system did. And the Nazis delivered much higher standards of living to the German population than the communists could ever even dream of. Now, some of this was, better management and more efficiency and more people who had higher technological capabilities in engineering and organisation and so on and so forth. But that's something that, so when you're comparing the two, the subservience to the state that the Nazis required, and they did require it, but the subservience still allowed for reality. It still allowed for personal choice, personal judgment. It still allowed the individual to be an individual to a large extent, not completely, to a large extent. Now, there are things that are castigated, like, well, the Hitler Youth, that's clearly, fucking Hitler and the Nazis. But there was the Communist Youth as well. And if you didn't attend the Communist Youth, you'd be in trouble. You'd get a knock on the door. Whereas if you didn't attend the Hitler Youth or weren't involved with it, then you wouldn't be denied employment. Somebody wouldn't come around and kill you or so on. So there's much more personal liberty and personal freedom and personal ownership in the fascist system than there was in the communist system. So if you were to take out the mass murdering of Jews and gypsies and that sort of stuff, if you would take that away, then the personal freedoms, rule of law, those sorts of things were far less oppressive in the Nazi system than it was in the Soviet communist system, or the Chinese communist system, or the Cambodian, the murderous Pol Pot regime. So we need to understand totalitarianism that in isolation, as in total subservience to the state, assuming that we keep that into that definition, then the fascist system was far less oppressive. It required the ballot box, victory at the ballot box. It required And it's interesting just looking at the Nazi officials, independent again of the mass murdering stuff. Just looking at the Nazi officials, they genuinely wanted to improve the lives of the citizens and that the population would come with them. Even the educational curriculum. Now, sure, the Nazis wanted to gin up the achievements of German historical characters in German history. They wanted to gin it up and maybe water down some of the other. During the Weimar Republic, there'd been a heavy dose of Marxism had been put into the education system. The Nazis wanted to take that out and did, and so. But you still look at the curriculum. That was ginned up. That it was still couched in reality. And this was the thing that made it, I think, palatable to the population and brought them along with them. At any time, I think up until probably 1943, 44, if there had been a vote on, I think the Nazis would have won it. And if you look at, say, 1938 or something like that, I think the Nazis would have won landslide majorities in an election. Whereas I think if the Communist Party and the Soviet Union had stood for an election like a competitive election, they would have been lucky to get 25% of the vote. And so this is a difference. The people were not going with. The people had to be terrorized and killed, whereas the Nazis, they were really brought along because they could see the benefit. They were getting jobs, better jobs. They were getting a higher standard of living. And the place had calmed down. There weren't communist street gangs running around beating up magistrates or local town councillors and these sorts of things. So the rule of law, orderly society had been brought back. So these are some of the differences. So when you look at totalitarianism, sure, the Nazis should get a gig, as should Mussolini. But if we really want to look at totalitarianism and its rawest form, where this subservience to the state is demanded and they'll kill you if you don't give it, then we need to look at communism and in the Soviet Union and China and Cambodia. And that's where the real lessons will be learned. You've been a task to us today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.